past and present. My name is Darren Miller. I'm the CEO of ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, and we have some wonderful speakers joining us here today. But for our opening address, I'd like to introduce Minister Josh Wilson to say a few words. Josh is the member for Fremantle in Western Australia and has been since 2016. He has the responsibility for energy efficiency and climate adaptation. And I think he's an avid swimmer. He was endeavouring to have a swim in the Caspian Sea, but thought better of it when he got down there. So Josh, please come to the lectern and say a few words. Thank you.
Thanks, Darren. It's great to be here again in the Australia Pavilion at COP29. I don't know if there's a better place to be. It's a privilege to be here, and I'll start by saying kaya, which is how we say g'day in the part of Australia that I'm from, Fremantle or Walyalup, the lands of the Whadjuk Noongar people. I'm not going to detain you very long because I think the best thing someone in my position can do is speak briefly and then let you enjoy the value of the panel of experts that have been formed to talk about ultra low cost solar. Australia has a good solar story to tell, especially when it comes to the kind of consumer energy resource aspect of solar, distributed solar, household photovoltaic cells. We're the country with the largest penetration of household solar in the world, and that wasn't achieved by accident, and it was really, really significantly facilitated by the work of ARENA. As Darren mentioned, 740 projects with $2.65 billion in grant funding. Significantly, that funding unlocked co-investment to the tune of $12.74 billion for critical renewable energy decarbonisation projects across Australia. Our confidence as a government in ARENA and our sense that the progress we've made to date is really only the beginning is represented or reflected in the fact that the current government has allocated a further $7.1 billion to ARENA through the funding package called Future Made in Australia. And the focus of that, of course, is continuing the decarbonisation and energy transformation journey that we've been on. Without question, what happened in Australia would not have occurred without very, very significant decrease in the cost of solar PV. And in just the last 10 years, innovations and scale have delivered an 85% reduction in the cost of solar PV, and that is what enabled this remarkable transformation in Australia. When the Rudd Labor government was elected in 2007, across Australia there were 12,000 households that had home PV, had home solar, 12,000. That was basically 1 in 1,000 households. 12 million households, 12,000 with home solar, 1 in 1,000. Today it is 1 in 3. In my home state it is 2 in 5. That's a remarkable transformation. That's how we've become the world leader in household solar penetration. But there's still the other 2/3 to go. And there's still the challenge of trying to support countries in our region and be part of that global work so that as many people can share in the benefits of distributed, cheap, clean solar energy. And in order to do that, we're going to need it to continue to see cost savings and continue to see work to make that technology available as broadly as we possibly can. Whenever I'm fortunate enough to go on behalf of the Australian government into other parts of the world, it's the question I'm asked a lot. People do recognise how we have gone with household PV, and they would like to try and make that a bigger part of what they do. So I'm sure we're going to hear a bit about that from the panel today. Thanks to you all for coming along, and I hope you have someone who only has a couple of hours of COP29 left before I hop on a plane and go back for a week of the Australian Parliament. I hope you have an excellent COP29.
Well, thank you, Josh. And it may be pretty confusing why we're hosting a panel on solar when you've just heard from Josh how we've done so well. And to unpack the rationale for why ultra-low-cost solar is actually quite different and so crucially important, I'm going to invite my colleague Alicia Cancelo, who's a director in my strategy team, to come and give you a short explanation of what ultra-low-cost solar is and why it's important. And after that, we're going to have a fantastic panel discussion. Welcome, Alicia.
Thanks, Darren, and hi, everyone. So I actually wanted to start this session by looking back over some of the most important COP milestones that we've seen over the last 20 years, and also how the forecasts have changed over that same period for how much solar PV we'd have installed by 2030. So if we cast our minds back to 2004, it's COP10 in Argentina. I was in high school, and I'm quite loath to admit I was in the debating team, although I'm sure there's a few people in the audience who were debaters. And it was right before the Kyoto Protocol actually came into force. So I distinctly remember that the topic for the finals was whether the Kyoto Protocol is actually a positive development. And I was on the team that had to argue that a global emissions reduction target was actually a terrible idea. So that year, the IEA came out with some forecasts for 2030, and they estimated that by 2030, we would have a total installed capacity of 76 gigawatts. They said, and I quote, "Solar PV has the highest costs of all commercially deployed renewable energy sources, ranging between $350 and $600 per megawatt hour, and it will not compete with other technologies for large-scale electricity unless we see dramatic cost reductions." So fast forward to 2015. So it was COP21, signing of the Paris Agreement. And that year, the IEA was somewhat more optimistic and thought that by 2030, we would have 1.7 terawatts of installed solar PV globally. Fast forward again to 2024, and as of last week, we've actually installed already 2 terawatts of solar. And the IEA has come out with forecasts again for 2030 that with even current policies, we'll be reaching 6 terawatts of solar, but in a net zero scenario, we'll be getting as high as 9 terawatts of solar. So to give a sense of the scale of difference in these forecasts over the last 20 years that I can't really convey in this chart, that's an increase of 120 times over a period of 20 years. So I wanted to call attention to this, not to question the reliability of forecasts, but I think it's important to recognise that for a long time we've really been underestimating the role of solar PV in our energy mix. And I think if history is anything to go by, we should have good reason to be optimistic about the years ahead. So I'll say a few words about ARENA, the Australian Renewable Energy Agency, not to be confused with IRENA, as I've learnt from joining this COP. So we were set up by the Australian government in 2012, and there's 2 main ways that we have impact. One of them is through financial assistance, so we provide grant funding to innovative renewable energy projects. And the second way is that we do knowledge sharing from those projects, where we share back the learnings with industry to try to accelerate progress. And there are a lot of different parts to our vision and our mission that I won't call out, but I think for this audience it's important to make the point that we focus not only on Australian emissions reduction, but actually on global emissions reduction, because we think that Australia has a really important role to play in, as a renewable energy superpower is the term that we use, from actually exporting the commodities and the value-added products and also the innovations to the rest of the world. So to date, as the Minister said, we've invested almost $2.7 billion since we were set up, which is about 1.7 billion US, across 740 projects. And we've been able to unlock around 4 times that in investment from other sources through those projects. And we invest across the whole innovation chain, so from R&D and studies through to demonstrations and deployment projects. And we have 5 strategic priorities, which is based on where we think we can have the most impact on emissions reduction. And I may be somewhat biased, but I actually think that this first priority on ultra low cost solar is actually one of the most important priorities. And the reason for that is that it actually can unlock all of the other priorities. And I'll talk through why. Because we've seen great progress in solar PV, the IEA now is thankfully saying that solar PV is the cheapest form of energy generation that we've seen in history, and the costs have come down over 85% over the last 3 decades. And also in countries that have a lot of land and high levels of solar irradiance, like Australia, China, Brazil, the US, parts of the Middle East, it's a clear winner for decarbonising our grids. And we've already seen huge progress there. But we think we're not yet taking advantage of what solar can actually do in getting us to net zero. Because if we can reduce the costs dramatically, we can unlock the production of green molecules like hydrogen and fuels for shipping and aviation. We can help to electrify industry. We can make products like green iron for export. And we can also power direct air capture, which we think will become increasingly important in an overshoot scenario. But what do we mean by ULCS? So first of all, today's solar modules convert about 24% of the available energy into usable electricity. But by 2030, we want to be seeing conversion rates over 30%. And the second part is around the installation of solar, particularly in the utility scale. So we have the solar modules, but we also have the racking and mounting, the trackers, the cabling, the inverters, and all of the labour that we need to actually install those. So we want to be able to see the cost of those components continue to come down, but we also want to be seeing huge levels of automation out in the field. And by our calculations, in Australia, which has relatively high labour costs, we think we need to bring down the cost of solar on an LCOE and installed cost basis by 2/3 to unlock other industries such as hydrogen. And then finally, I've got ahead of myself. So the final is on the installation rate. So there's a lot of estimates out there, but we think that dramatically cheaper solar can drastically increase deployment rates. And we've done our own calculations where we think that to meet future energy demands in Australia, we need to be deploying solar at a rate of 10x what we're deploying today from 2030 onwards. And we have a vision for 1 terawatt of installed solar in Australia by 2050. So there's some pretty ambitious numbers up there, we know that, but ARENA really does think it's possible. And what we did earlier this year was we convened what we called the Solar Lab, where we brought together a range of stakeholders who are never really in a room together. So it was a really valuable process. So we brought together researchers, developers, EPCs, policymakers, financiers, technology companies, and we basically spent 2 days locked in a room trying to put together all of the pieces of the puzzle that need to come together. So I won't go through all of these. I know there's a lot of boxes on this page, but a few call-outs would be, first of all, on R&D. So we're making good progress towards 30% with current technologies, but we think that the emerging technologies can get us closer to 40%. And the big priority there is making sure that the degradation rates aren't as high as they are today. And there's amazing solar research happening in Australian universities, also in the organisations like NREL and LONGI, and so we really need to supercharge that work. Then on manufacturing, so we know that China is currently dominating the global supply chain, but we're starting to see a lot more policy coming into place for other manufacturing capabilities in other markets. So ARENA launched our Solar Sunshot program recently, which is really starting to explore what role Australia could play in the global supply chain. And a big focus for ARENA is on installation and operations and maintenance. So there's a couple of things here we need to focus on to bring the cost down. One of those is actually getting the engineers and the startups to think about new designs and new ways to deploy solar and new ways to operate. So we want to see high levels of prefabrication and robotics, automation. So we actually ran a solar scale-up challenge earlier this year where we put the call out to global companies to bring their best ideas to us for how they could deploy it or operate it in a new way. And we ended up with 140 different submissions from 17 different countries, which was well beyond what we'd imagined. So that innovation is already happening out there, but we need to be able to commercialise it as quickly as possible. And the other part of installation that's really important is what we call the productization of solar. So at the moment, they're deployed in a very bespoke way for each individual project out in the field. So we want to be bringing in some of the principles from factories around automation and high standardization and repetition and applying that to how it's installed out in the field. And the final call out I'd make is on offtake, because that's really critical. So we need the big players who will have demand for low-cost electrons in the future, thinking of the big mining companies and big industrial players. We really want them to be coming to the table to help support these innovations and this new way of deploying solar and working with the developers to actually stand up innovation sandboxes within their projects so that we can commercialise them as quickly as possible. And obviously there's a lot of other things we need to fall into place with our panel will be covering. So there's a lot to be cracking on with, but I'm really looking forward to seeing where we land by the time COP35 rolls around, and I'm really hoping that we can surprise ourselves yet again with the progress that we've made. Thanks, everyone, and I'll hand back to Darren.
Okay, ladies and gentlemen, let's get into the panel discussion. So if I can invite Martin, Georgia, and Rodrigo to come up and take their seats, perhaps from here in that order. Rodrigo, come one forward. I'll sit on the end in a minute. And I'll briefly introduce our panelists. So Dr. Rodrigo Sauaia. Rodrigo is the co-founder and CEO of the Brazilian Solar Photovoltaic Energy Association, otherwise known as ABSOLAR, the national association representing companies and professionals from all segments in the solar PV value chain with operations in Brazil. Rodrigo serves as the main representative of the solar PV sector in Brazil, directly interfacing with high-level decision makers, presenting at national and international events, and providing strategic advice to ABSOLAR's associate members. He's also the co-founder and member of the board of directors of the Global Solar Council, GSC, the global entity unifying and representing the solar power sector at the international level. Welcome, Rodrigo. We also have Georgia Holt with us. Georgia is the Managing Director of Climate Connect, a consultancy that helps clients across various industries in reaching their climate targets. She also supports the Commonwealth Bank of Australia with their renewables procurement in Australia and overseas. Georgia's been working in sustainability and climate action for more than a decade in Australia and North and South America across mining, agriculture, heavy industry, and now financial services. She's a proud Awabakal woman and is passionate about empowering Indigenous Australians in the transition to a low-carbon society. Welcome, Georgia. And we have Dr. Martin Keller. Martin is the director of the National Renewable Energy Laboratory, otherwise known as NREL, and president of the Alliance for Sustainable Energy. Under Martin's leadership, NREL has more than 1,000 partnerships with industry, universities, foundations, and governments. Martin has contributed significantly to the development of NREL's strategy, focusing on 3 key initiatives: integrated energy pathways, electrons to molecules, and the circular economy. Martin, thank you for joining us as well. I'll take my seat and we can kick off. Right, that sounds different. Martin, I might start with you. We've heard from Alicia that solar PV is indeed the cheapest form of energy available. And so, with that in mind, why do you think it's important that we're focusing on reducing costs even further? Why can't we declare victory and just get on with it?
Yeah, look, first of all, thank you for having me here. By the way, I loved your slides because a lot of this actually you already said why it's so important. So, but look, I was, from a very high level, I always make this comparison that can you imagine you're living in a house without having a kitchen? So everybody would say, well, so of course I need a kitchen. I think we need to think this way, that why, if you have a house, why you don't have solar panels on your rooftop? So if you really see that you want to go to very deep deployment of solar, then of course the major thing how this is driven is by cost. So this is why it's important that we continue to further decrease costs. So I think that it's a no-brainer to make electricity within our homes, make it cheaper, and find different ways to do this. And this is, and we probably come into the panel some more into this discussion how we are doing this, because, well, on your slide you can improve efficiency, yeah, but for some points I could see that's interesting, but also the much, in my view, even faster way to do this is just to make solar so cheap that you can it everywhere. We at NREL, we're having this project called Solar Everywhere, which is also with a lot of government organizations, but also with industries, to see what will it take that solar is becoming so cheap that you can put it almost like on roads, on everywhere. And there's new technologies out there where we can achieve this, and we probably will talk about this later in the panel, but just stop there. I think there's a lot of really cool technologies out there where I will predict that solar in the next 10, 15 years will see another big push towards being even more and much cheaper than it is right now.
Great, thank you. Yeah, you wouldn't bet against it, would you, given all the incorrect forecasts we've seen of its success? Rodrigo, I might turn to you. So Brazil, somewhat a competitor, but a collaborator with Australia, hopefully. You guys have had great success. You're a bit ahead of Australia in terms of installation capacity. and we've seen that installation grow and the costs come down. What have been the success factors in Brazil's solar journey so far?
Well, hello everyone, and thank you first of all to the Australian government and to ARENA for the invitation to be here today with you all. Darren, excellent question, and also my greetings to Martin and to Georgia. From my side, I would just first like to say that I see Brazil and Australia as definitely partners and not competitors. So I think there is opportunities here for us to work together and to build together a better future. I completely agree with Martin. We need to make solar ubiquitous. That's the word that we use. It needs to be everywhere, in all applications possible, and also in end consumer products. And the experience we had in Brazil, actually we started way not ahead, but behind Australia, right? 10 years ago, no one was talking about Brazil in solar photovoltaics. Our market was insignificant. We had important changes that helped us move the market forward. But just to give you a perspective, because maybe many people might not know about the Brazilian electricity sector, Brazil today has almost 90% of its electricity coming from renewables already. That's today. I know that Australia has a target of 83% renewables by 2030. We are already there, actually past it. But that was done basically with hydro in the past. Big hydro power plants. And we needed to diversify. In our case, the pain was not too many emissions in the electricity grid, but too much reliance on hydro and water. And we know the climate is changing quite significantly. So droughts started to become a big problem for our electricity generation. And then we started a big diversification with first biomass, then wind, and then came solar. But in such a way that solar today is the second largest electricity source in Brazil. It represents 20% of the country installed capacity, with roughly 48 gigawatts in operation today. Just last year, we were the third largest solar market in the world, with 15 gigawatts added. So this is significant development. And I can deep dive a little bit more through our chat into how we did it. But I believe that showcases a little bit of what we have as opportunities. Brazil has a huge solar resource, and we have relied on the support of a net metering policy for the use of solar for small consumers, utility auctions by the government, so electricity auctions by the government. But these auctions today are not that relevant anymore. The market is moving forward with private PPAs. So solar became so cheap that the end consumer, the industries, the big electricity users are preferring it because it's the cheapest and cleanest way to produce electricity in the country now. And I know that's true in many parts of the world.
Great, thanks Rodrigo, and we'll dive into some of the nuts and bolts of that as we go. Georgia, I might turn to you and just ask you, let's take the negative side. What do you think the barriers are to further adoption of solar? What are your perspectives and perceptions of what could stop us realising this dream of ultra-low-cost solar at massive scale?
Thanks, Darren. And I'd like to say kai, which is hello in my local Awabakal language, similar to kui. I would say the main barriers that I see would be permitting and planning and how long it takes to get through the permitting process, with some projects taking several years to get off the ground. There certainly doesn't seem to be a lack of demand for renewables projects. It's more on the supply side, getting these projects off the ground quick enough. And the second main barrier, I would say, is competition for available land that doesn't conflict with agriculture, conservation, native title, and now carbon projects as well. So access to available land that is suitable for renewables projects is definitely a challenge. And I would say that community consultation is vital to overcome this.
So if I can just follow up, because some technologies like wind get a lot of attention from communities. I guess you can see a wind turbine from a long distance. Solar doesn't seem to suffer from the same level of challenge from a social license perspective. Is that your perspective, or have I kind of misread the situation? Because it seems like solar's been, in a sense, literally under the radar.
Yeah, that's a very good question. I would say in my local community of the Hunter Valley, wind farms are definitely, I suppose, opposed by the local community, and solar kind of does scoot under the radar. And then also with Australia having such a high adoption rate of solar on our own rooftops, I just feel like communities are more open to the idea of solar in general.
Yeah, great. Okay. Well, let's switch into the research and development question. And Martin, I'll ask you, we've seen these incredible breakthroughs, as Alicia said. We're at the 24% efficiency level. I remember when I got my first PV system back in 2010, we were at about 17%. And we have this target to go to 30% and perhaps even beyond. What are your perspectives of how achievable that is? What are the breakthroughs that we might need? And where do you think this ends in terms of an efficiency levels for PV?
I mean, we all know there's technology out there where we have already much higher efficiencies. I mean, we always say, look at the so-called 3 5s. You probably all know about this. I mean, best example there is you probably all know Mars rover. So the solar panels on the rover are the 3 5s. They are having their records right now in efficiency, so they're far above 30%. But the problem is that they're much too expensive, because to manufacture them is very complicated. In space, I mean, makes a big difference, because I mean, and there you don't need the volume, you just need to have the highest efficiency, and then if it costs a lot of money, you can deal with this. So we always say, how do you bring 3 5s from space down to Earth? So we need new manufacturing ways to do this. So we're having a program which is also coming out of actually in this case, Department of Defense, which was interesting, that we're having this new ways how you can deposit some of these layers, where you bring down costs significantly from where we are right now. So this is a very interesting approach, I think, to go to very high efficiency at much lower cost. But then now on the other extreme, and right now we always look at this, that we're trying to develop solar panels to say, well, is it 20 years? Can we even do this longer? Is it perhaps 30 years? So, but I also argue, so if they're becoming super, super cheap, it might be okay that they only be out there 5 years. And what are some of these technologies? And some of you probably have heard about the so-called perovskites. That's in the news all over the place. I mean, I'll call them solar ink. I mean, for you all who are not in the specialty field there. So I always make this comparison that the vision with this solar inks is that you can, down the road, produce solar panels the way we make newspaper. So it's basically with the same type of machines where you do this very thin films as we do with newspapers, where you can bring them on very flexible kind of matrices. And with this, suddenly, you could envision that you open up whole new fields in facades for buildings, even also on windows, on even perhaps roads, and because the outlook for this technology is that you could achieve this and significantly bring down the cost for doing this. We feel that there's a lot of excitement out there. There's still some scientific issues we have to overcome. Problem is stability, because these molecules don't like water so much. So that's why you have to encapsulate them in a way, and also do some research to increase the kind of durability of these molecules. But also when you look at some of the graphs, it's also interesting that efficiency for these new molecules was exploding. So we are there already. So now we just have to build the kind of durability into these molecules. But I personally think that this could be a game changer for solar in the long run.
Hello? Okay, sorry. Just, I know it's very loud out there, so just to repeat that, Martin is putting it all on perovskites. Would that be the fair summation?
So look, I wouldn't say I would put everything on perovskites. I think, in what I said, we will have different market and different needs. And like this is, look, the other topic we have to discuss is what solar in off-grid applications will play a massive role in the decarbonization of our industry. But we will get to this point. So,
yep.
So the point is that what we will see is we will have high efficient cells at much lower cost and very low cost applications. And we then can tailor the solar technology and the panels and the materials to the needs what we see. And this will give us much more flexibility as we have right now.
Great, okay. So we've talked about the breakthroughs that are needed on cell efficiencies, which translates into module efficiencies. And then the other part to the equation, I'll turn to you, Rodrigo, is just to talk about What are these other innovations in how you install solar in the field? You know, there's obviously a single-axis tracking is probably the dominant technology today, and that requires a certain layout and a certain level of labour and materials. What are you seeing as the future of a different way, a more efficient way to install solar at large scale?
Well, yeah, we have to remind ourselves that there are many different applications for solar, and large scale will still be a significant share of the market moving onwards in the future. In this area, we have seen an increase in automation coming forward as well, especially in markets that have high labor costs. That might not be the case of Brazil specifically, but in other regions, we see that there is a lot of effort to try to do some of these steps almost as if you're building an industrial line at open sky, so to speak, right? And preparing the materials beforehand, so there's a part on organization and structuring when you do the mechanical part, the civil part of the work, and the electrical part of the work, but also using more robots during this process as well, not only in the factories to produce the modules, the equipment itself, but also to build the power plants. So these are some of the areas, and this can be combined also with innovations on the way we apply it, not only necessarily in land, but also on floating systems, for example. So you can use the advantage of having a water reservoir for a hydropower plant that is already built, and because of that, you have part of the infrastructure that you would need to build for a solar power plant, such as transmission lines and substations that are already there. And also people that will do the operation and maintenance and security that are already there for the hydro power plant. And so you can put the solar system there floating that will help you also reduce some of the evaporation of the water on the reservoir, so preserve some of that water, but at the same time use this infrastructure and reduce costs for the whole power plant. So combinations like this, not only with hydro, but also with wind, hybrid systems can help you reduce costs significantly as well.
Yeah, thank you. And that brings me back to sort of George's point about how do you integrate solar with communities and agriculture, for example. There ought to be co-benefits coming from the new types of solar that we'll deploy. But Georgia, I might just sort of turn to your the work you do supporting, say, the Commonwealth Bank with their renewable energy procurement. What do you see as the opportunities or challenges, if you want to call it that, of the end user, the customers, sort of signing up to solar PPAs? What are you observing with the demand side?
So I have to say that all of my responses from here on out do not reflect that of the Commonwealth Bank, and instead that they reflect a First Nations Australian who's been working in consulting for the last 10 years. Having said that, I would say that there's no shortage of demand, like I said. Once companies go through their greenhouse gas accounting, they often find that renewables are the low-hanging fruit to reduce emissions. And so they'll go and find out what kind of renewables are available. And then they generally go through a process of maturity. So they might look at buying LGCs, the large-scale generation certificates, and then they might look at doing on-site generation for themselves or entering into a PPA. And I would say to get them to that point where they want to enter into a PPA, the biggest barrier would be education and awareness and understanding what the costs are of the PPA, like the transparency in the contracting, and then the impact of that PPA on emissions. And then the other barrier, I would say, is once they have decarbonised their operations and bought into renewables, the next thing that they can do is influence their supply chains and their customer base. I call that repowering the supply chain, and we're already seeing this with a number of companies like Apple and Telstra, where they are going out to their suppliers and asking who is already buying renewables, because that reduces the corporate Scope 3 emissions. And to get to that point, perhaps a PPA is not the right solution for a lot of the smaller suppliers. They can look at more flexible options like virtual PPAs or aggregated PPAs. Yeah.
Right. Thanks for that. My mic goes to sleep every few minutes, but we'll get there. Martin, NREL is really well known for R&D and translating that in partnerships with industry into solutions. What role do you think industry needs to play in these innovations in solar PV? What can industry do to lean in and drive these innovations from the lab through to commercialisation effectively?
So in our view, the collaboration with industry is absolutely critical. And what we have learned also, when you look in the history of a lot of energy technologies, that historically research was done, and let's use solar as a good example. I mean, when NREL got started now almost 50 years ago, it was this, and you highlighted this not even so long ago, but where people thought, yeah, solar is a niche market, it might be used for little tiny things, but it will never play a major role in utility production types. And so research developed this, but then it was a process where you then work with industry and then start to deploy. So I think to shorten this deployment curve and the innovation curve is that we are trying to bring industry into the research at an earlier stage, because we need to do this in partnership. We need to weed out things which cannot be scaled because of certain reasons, and do this partnership between the research, the institutes and industry at an earlier stage, and then with this move innovation at a faster and deployment. Perovskites, best example. So what we try to do here is to build an industry consortium. We have worked on this one now for a couple of years, and coming also back, I think someone you mentioned about competition. Look, we have humans on a planet to save, so this means we have to get moving. So how do we get this faster? And that's why we brought this consortium together. There's companies here from the US, from the UK. They're all working together, where we're working on this next level for perovskite. The next market product out there will be the so-called tandem cells. We use current technology and overlay this with a layer of perovskites. So the first product's now starting to show up. So, but the idea is to shorten this curve and this innovation to get technology out faster, and this cannot be done without industry.
Great. Yep, agree with that. One of the things that we're seeing in Australia, and no more so than Josh's great state of Western Australia, is solar penetration on rooftops is so high. I think in WA we're at 40% of residential rooftops, and I saw from the CEC the other day that we've just passed 4 million rooftop systems in Australia, and in a market of 10 million rooftops, so 40% penetration now, actually nationwide. But what that's doing is it's almost solar's own worst enemy is solar, because you're adding so much at the rooftop level that you're actually, in some ways, you can undermine the economics of large-scale solar and make the business case even harder to stack up. So we're seeing things like hybrid systems paired with batteries to ensure that you can smooth that profile and provide the energy later in the day. Rodrigo, are you experiencing that in Brazil, or what are you seeing elsewhere in your role, either in Brazil or around the world, where this challenge of so much solar at this coincident time needs to be factored in and dealt with? And what are you doing about it?
Great question, Darren. And this is something that we need to face and we need to find solutions for, because the fact that solar is becoming so cheap is not a problem. It's actually something very good, and that will help us reach our climate goals and also reduce the average price of electricity. But the thing is that we need to operate the system, the electricity system, in a different way than we are used to with the traditional sources. So we need to revolutionize a little bit the way we do this operation, and create more tools for flexibility in the system to deal with the variability of solar and other renewable resources such as wind, including more batteries, strengthening the grid infrastructure on low voltage, mid voltage and high voltage levels, but also taking the advantage of cheap solar that's available during the day to use this electricity to accelerate some of the electrification of the economy that we need to do. So not only operate on the logic of the electricity sector, but really bring the economy to the electricity sector and work together with them. We're having ever more need, for example, for power because of the growth of information technology and artificial intelligence. Why not use the solar power to power the artificial intelligence revolution that is coming with it? We have to produce clean fuels. Why not use this excess and available cheap solar to produce hydrogen at the time that we have it available, and then store that, for example. And also using the batteries to store the solar during the day, to use it during the afternoon or during the night when peak demand increases as well. So I think that we need to change some of the logic of the operation of the system. This has to do with regulation, with legislation, but also with a discussion of how to implement some of these technologies into practice.
Yeah, that's great. And the other aspect as well is consumer behavior. We need to, as consumers, understand that we need to shift our consumption patterns to some degree, set our devices to operate during the day, charge our vehicles during the day, switch to electric hot water. These are the things that are needed to create the load in the middle of the day to support a much more efficient use of solar rather than storing every last electron.
Definitely. And this consumer behavior has to be connected with signals, market signals. So if we have, for example, differentiated electricity prices on an hourly basis, when in the hours where we have a lot of solar available, electricity prices will go down. And if this could be initially seen as a challenge for people that are trying to sell electricity at that time, for the end consumers, this is music, because you have one of the most important resources for our digitalized society at a cheap value. But the prices need to be perceived correctly by the end consumer. So when you set your consumption, you definitely want to put it in the middle of the day for your washing machine or your dryer or your heating system at home. So when you're home back at the end of the day, instead of paying a larger price for your electricity, you already have prepared it when it's cheaper, for example.
Excellent. So, look, we've talked about the research side and the efficiency of the modules. We've talked about the deployment side and solar success to date. But Georgia, I think the most important question on my mind, and I think you would have great insights into this challenge, is just if we have all of that available, it's now a question of mass deployment rapidly. We've got a very urgent problem to solve with climate, and we know that solar takes up a lot of land. And what really worries me is whether we are engaging meaningfully and successfully with communities, First Nations communities, agricultural farmers, landowners throughout Australia, for example. Do you think we've got the settings right to deploy 10 times more solar per year than we're doing today, and have that accepted by communities and have communities benefit through that change? What are you thinking about in terms of that challenge of scale deployment?
Well, I love that you agree. It's such an important topic, community engagement, and I would say that there's a few principles that we can apply to get not best practice, but just minimum standard when it comes to deploying these renewables projects. And I would say they are, one, early and genuine consultation with community groups, and obviously transparent communications, and then two would be the benefit sharing of the project itself. So that would be equity share, revenue share from the project, going out into the communities and listening to what their priorities are in terms of community development, and then building those priorities into the project itself. And that will create a more mutually beneficial partnership rather than just a transactional relationship with these communities. And that can be applied to not just our First Nations Australians, but any local community to bring them along the journey as well. The benefit sharing can not just be revenue share and equity, but also employment and training. And that really builds community capacity and resilience and creates generational change. And I have some good examples that I can share later. I would also say that having been here for the last week and listening to what our First Nations Australians are saying is that they know what the concerns are in their communities and they have ideas for the solutions, and they want to be listened to. So they want you to come out and engage with them, and they want a platform to be heard. So for goodness sake, listen once you do that original engagement. But I would say there's a long way to go in terms of getting to best practice, and that free, prior informed consent and UNDRIP, so the rights for Indigenous peoples, that shouldn't be seen as the gold standard. It should be seen as the bare minimum. And we have a lot to learn from other countries like New Zealand and Canada in that space.
Yeah, thank you for that perspective. And I think it's the renewable transition and supporting First Nations communities to become owners and operators of these farms. I think they're fantastic co-benefits, if you like, that we can achieve both together. So it's a really wonderful opportunity, but needs to be done well. So totally agree with you. So I might just, Martin, I know you're a sort of innovation lab and on the research side, but just with that US lens that you've got, just thinking about the policy settings that are available in the US, what can we in Australia or Brazil, for example, learn about what are the effective policy or financing mechanisms that might be available? Because I think it's not always just about the technology, it's about the general policy environment, regulatory environment, and the financing opportunities to help facilitate this.
I'm not sure if I'm really the best person to answer this, but I tell you one thing which is full circle now what we talked earlier, especially I think in the United States, the best thing to increase deployment is to make it cheap because everything goes through money. And so if a homeowner sees a value by putting solar out there, or if a utility sees the value of deploying solar, then if it's cheaper, then it's increasing. So, but if you're okay, I would like to follow up on your point because look, this is something which we at NREL, this is dear to our heart right now. This question about how do you engage communities, and also how do you make this just energy transition. And some of you might know we redesigned the whole LA, big city, of course, in the US, asked us to create this implementation plan to go to 100% renewable energy. And then, of course, the follow-up project there was exactly this, that you will design this very different in Beverly Hills than in South LA. So why is this important? Because if you have the means in Beverly Hills, well, you can build a solar panel and you get a Powerwall in here, and then you have your Tesla in the garage, that's fine. South LA, a lot of the homes even do not allow to put solar panels on the rooftop because the roof would collapse. So how do you bring also these communities along? And this is what you said is so important, that we're reaching this level right now, that the work with the communities is absolutely critical to further deploy this technology.
Great, thank you. So just to give you forewarning, I'm going to allow the audience to ask some questions. I'm sure you might have some available, so have a think if you don't, and we'll just wrap up with maybe one further question from me to the panel. I'll let the panel also just wrap up for themselves, but let's say we've got the efficiency goal sorted, we've got this new way of installing at scale that's just really cheap, so we've got our ultra-low-cost solar. We've also engaged meaningfully with communities throughout Australia and the globe on deployment. The last thing on my mind is supply chains. We are deploying terawatts a year now of solar, let's say. We've got all the ingredients, but one of the things that exercises our minds in Australia is just the concentration of supply chains, particularly in China. We have a lot to thank for China for perfecting the manufacturing of solar modules. But it is a risk that we've got one country that's so dominant in the supply chains, and as we're deploying terawatts of solar, or attempting to, how concerned should we be? Rodrigo, perhaps to start with you, is this on your mind in Brazil about the concentration risk of where solar and technology is made?
Thank you, Darren. May I come back very quickly to the point of policy, just so that I can complement a little bit on that? And then I'll go to the point of the value chain. So starting on the policy side, I just wanted to highlight the importance of policy. Because in fact, solar would not be where it is today if it weren't for good policy and public support, including subsidies, to get the technology going, right, in the beginning. We have a lot to thank for public support for R&D development. It wouldn't be possible because in the beginning the private sector was not strong enough to finance its R&D as it is today. The majority of the R&D for solar photovoltaics is private today, not public, but it has not started like that. So it was very important to have the support of good policies, and this not only includes the part of development, research and innovation, but also deployment. We need adequate policies to help the market move forward, to help people use the technology, to find places for end consumers to have solar either on the rooftops or large-scale projects. I gave the example of Brazil. So we had a net metering regulation, national net metering regulation, that was a big success. We managed to transform this into a permanent law, working together with the Congress. So this was a big step forward. Other countries moved into feed-in tariff. which was great. It was the case of Germany and other European countries with also much success. And also the auctions, the public auctions that I mentioned, were very relevant. So these policies need to be spread around the world because we need to see this growth go forward to more and more countries as well. Having said that, when we talk about the value chain, we have to also highlight the importance of having the value chain moving forward without barriers. One thing that's really on our mind, and I have to share the case of Brazil to ask you not to commit this same mistake in your countries, especially the governments. I arrived here and took my mobile out of airplane mode, right, out of the airplane. And the first message that popped in was that Brazil had just increased import taxes from 9% to 25% on solar modules. And I was devastated. And the solar market was absolutely devastated by this news because at the end, what this makes is it makes solar more expensive to the end consumer, to the society. So this is actually not helping us move forward with the energy transition, but decelerating the energy transition. So it is definitely important to value the distribution of the solar chain throughout the world, but we shouldn't do that by punishing the market and punishing the end consumer. So please do not follow that path. Let's avoid closing markets and creating barriers to the development of solar or other technologies on behalf of having more industries in your country. Let's find other ways. And what I could suggest that we know that has worked well in other markets is having, for example, the commitment from the government to buy locally produced solar goods to install in public buildings, for example. There are a lot of solar public buildings that could have solar systems installed on it. Or if the government does a government-led solar auction for large-scale power plants, maybe he can have a share of locally produced goods in that power plants as well. So these are ways in which the government is using its buying power instead of making the end consumer pay more for a technology that needs to accelerate.
Wonderful. I agree with you totally. Well done. Right. Audience, your turn. We got Matt. Okay. Well, Matt, and then pass it behind you after that.
Hi there, Matthew Knight from Australia. I have a question maybe firstly for Rodrigo, but George or Martin, I'd love your input too. In solar deployments in Australia, we found that EPCs and financiers and developers have become very good at delivering larger and larger projects. And the principal way that they reduce costs is by doing a repeatable process that's the same every time. And we're struggling to get more innovation into that system to take larger leaps in cost reductions. How do you think we can bring innovations, not just in cells and modules, but in deployment and in operations and maintenance, into real-life developments and deployments faster and more effectively?
Okay, thank you. That's an excellent question, actually. And I would start by saying that we can start working on new business models as well. As solar is becoming cheaper, the applications where solar can be used are growing significantly. So we cannot only think about doing solar on rooftops only, as if this was the only market option that small businesses have, or doing large-scale power plants on the ground, like this was the only thing that solar could do. And I want to come back with one point that you brought forward, and also Darren brought on the question, which is a potential dispute between agricultural use of land and, electricity generation use of land. With solar becoming as cheap as it is, now you can combine both technologies to have the same area produce two revenues. It can produce solar electricity, and below the solar panels, you can have crops growing. You can have vegetables, you can have fruits, you can have many different types of crops that can be grown there and produce a second revenue stream for the owner of the land, for example, or for a community. So this thinking on new business models and new approaches on how to use solar, and also working on community solar strategies, I think this is an interesting way to move forward. Another thing is we have to take advantage of digitalization into the solar sector. So the Internet of Energy, for example, starting to use virtual power plants or starting to offer new services with solar plus energy storage to the grid. so that we can supply more with this technology than only electrons, only clean electrons.
Building on that, I would say in terms of innovative financial solutions, listening to a panel the other day called Unlocking the Trillions, and the professor from the Columbia University, he was talking about how cross-sectoral collaboration is really important as well. So, for example, Anglo-American and EDF over in South Africa are building large renewables projects to decarbonise Anglo's Scope 2 emissions. That's one example. And then the other one would be blended finance, so where you have the public sector providing funding that can act as a first loss to unlock private finance, and that's something that ARENA does really well in terms of providing $2 billion to unlock the $8 billion. That's really important. And then an example from Canada, just because I would love to provide one of their financing. The Canadian government provided $5 billion in funding to the First Nations Major Projects Coalition, and that was for advising their First Nations people in how to be owners in these major projects, and that's in renewables and mining and a whole bunch of different things. So we could, I guess, replicate that here in Australia with a very similar situation.
Great. Checked. Martin, anything on that? Okay, we've got a question in the middle there.
Hello, I'm Ali Zafar, Economic Advisor with UN based in Ethiopia. And we are struggling to get solar to Africa. And if you look at the cost of solar globally, as you have said, is coming down. But if we look at logistics costs, battery costs, capital costs, uncertain policy, it's still quite high. So the question is, Georgia mentioned PPP, blended finance. The question is, does the government have to take a big kind of subsidy for the private sector to come? Because the private sector perceives Africa as quite risky. So renewables has not been able to scale up. What's that mix between public and private? Thank you.
Do you want me to take that one? Yeah, so I would say that the finance is available. That's what we keep hearing. They're just trying to find the right projects to invest in. But the finance wants a very distinct box in terms of the high returns, low risk, certainty, security. And what the professor from the Columbia University was saying is that perhaps private finance needs to change their credit ratings, the kind of credit ratings that they will accept, or they need to be reviewing their funding policies, which is, it might be a difficult thing, but in terms of unlocking the trillions, that might be what's required.
Okay.
Hopefully that answers your question.
Any other questions from the audience before we wrap up?
Larry Moffat with the Press Club Brussels Europe. First, a comment. Coming from Belgium, it's surprising to learn that in a country like Australia, with your wide open spaces, that you have a problem of land availability. But my question relates to the last point you made about concentration of supply. Can the new technologies that you're working on for higher efficiency, lower cost PV cells disrupt the incumbent in a way to make the US or Brazil or Australia more competitive if manufacturing is ready?
So I think when you look at perovskites, they are very abundant. So I mean, you synthesize them. So I think there is a way. Of course, on the 3.5s, I mean, we still have this problem there, even if you make the materials are the same, which brings up exactly what we talked here. I think the supply chain, sometimes when I listen to what you said, that sometimes governments forget that. I understand that we want to do manufacturing in our countries, but the real jobs in solar specifically is in installation and maintenance. So the percentage of people actually manufacturing the cells is very small in compared when you have it. And again, I will say this: you cannot farm out installation of solar panels to China because you install them in your country. So that's sometimes we're forgetting this. So it's this, well, we want to have all the manufacturing back, and I get it. But the point is, I would bring this from a one country level to a higher level, because I think, well, I'm originally from Germany, as you can hear. I'm in Europe. What have you learned from the last issue? That if you get dependent on only one provider of energy, I mean, in this case it was Russian gas from Germany, then you're getting into this dependence. And so for us, I think we have to do that, yes, that we're getting the supply chain, but that we have to diversify the supply chain to a level that many different people can be the supplier of individuals component. And as soon as one component is owned by one specific country, then you're getting into a problem. And I think that's also what we're trying to do is when you try to look at new energy materials, scalability also depends on what the resources required to scale it. And for example, if you would see that this is only one specific little country with one few mines, where the original resources are coming from, we would get very skeptical and might not push this further, because then you will run into the same problem.
I wanted to build on that point. Just also remember that the solar value chain is very complex and diverse. So solar modules are definitely one important component of a solar system, but they are not the only one. In our case in Brazil, for example, we have a very diverse local value chain producing trackers, for example, producing electric and electronic components that are essential for our solar system when it's being installed. Also the substation components, transformers, transmission lines. This is all made in Brazil. So when you have a solar project that is being installed, even if it is using a solar module that was manufactured abroad, independently of which country, you still have a lot of local content on that system. And you're generating local jobs, a lot of local jobs, because of the project, the installation, the operation, the management, the maintenance afterwards. So maybe look into which country and what are the strengths that the country has in terms of a local value chain that can create competitive components to help reduce the price of the technology instead of increasing it.
Okay, we still have some more questions. We've got some time, so let's have the next question. Thank you.
Hi, thanks. James from Australia. My question is that given that solar is so low, it's mostly the lowest cost of energy in many countries, what are the barriers preventing us from moving away from fossil fuels to solar even faster, and even why are we still approving new fossil fuel plants in some countries? Why haven't we hit peak fossil fuel yet? And what needs to happen for us to move that forward by many, many years?
So let me start on one thing, and I tell you this, in the utilities, and I'm sure you might go down the same in Brazil or also in Australia. I remember this when years ago we had this project with Hawaii, where the utility said, well, we're reaching the maximum of solar panels on the rooftop, then the grid gets unstable and we can handle this anymore. And we could show on this large-scale facilities we have that they were wrong, so they could deploy much more. And then, Australia has shown it, you have shown it, Germany has shown this, that you can go. So there's still this industry is very conservative on one hand. And then, of course, then the other point is right now with current existing fleets, the so-called stranded assets is a big issue. If you have steel in the ground for a plant, and then you say, well, you shut it down, there's cost there. And then also moving over to renewables, there's additional costs in the deployment side. So this is why there is still, at least in the US, there's this tug of war. How much stranded assets do you want? And then when you look at coal, for example, why is a lot of utilities in the US leaving coal? Because to operate these plants are getting so expensive that it's easier to say, well, we turn them off, have them as stranded asset, build them back, and move to renewables. So, but again, the driver is to further bring down the cost of renewables, then it will be easier for the utilities to make this transition.
Well, I'll build on that. I think, yes, keeping on reducing the prices is important, but we have to understand that there are interests, big economic interests behind this situation as well. So for many years, there were those who were saying that all these greenhouse gas emission debate, this is a fluke, this is something fake, this is not something relevant. Now we are at 1.5 degrees already for 12 months in a row. So we reached the target that we are supposed to stay at. Your question is very good and important and should be done in every session here, I would say. So thank you for that. Apart from these interests, economic interests, unfortunately, still today, fossil fuel is it's very rentable. It generates a lot of profits. So, and that's why we need to include some of the damage that it's causing and it's not on its price. This was called in the past externalities. One of these debates is carbon emissions or other pollutants that are bad for our health, and we're paying this on the health system indirectly. These costs are not necessarily just for the health system, but they are also for the technology that's causing it. So if we apply more of this logic, then we'll show these technologies are not as rentable, they are not as profitable as they look, because they cause a lot of other damages as well.
The only thing I could add to that is that the grid is also very fragile, I would say. The Eraring Power Station, which is close to where I'm from in Newcastle, they would like to phase out the coal there, but they're actually having to extend for a couple of years in order to keep the electricity flowing and the lights on, which everyone obviously wants. So we just need more renewables faster, and we needed to start 10 years ago, but we're getting there. The other thing I would say, coming from Newcastle, is that you would be surprised how many people who are in the coal chain, who work at the coal mines, are climate deniers, saying that climate change is not real, global warming is not man-made, and that's because their jobs are at risk, and there's real palpable fear in our regions that they're not going to have jobs as soon as the transition gets to a tipping point where they're going to have to get out of coal and into renewables projects. So the kind of work that Turnbull was talking about before, providing jobs in renewables to people in the Upper Hunter, that's really valuable as well.
James, I might just sort of build on all of that and say, in the Australian context, from an economic perspective, solar will win if it's able to connect to the grid, because we've got an energy-only market that gives you a very distinct price signal to tell you that you can add this generation mix to the grid and it'll be dispatched. The challenges are transmission. We need enough transmission lines built to the right places to access the resource, and we know that that is happening, but it's slow and it's difficult and expensive. And the other side is grid balancing. Once we have solar, it's a different kind of energy generation asset than coal and gas, and we need to have synchronous condensers or other ways to run the grid synchronously that make up for the reduction in coal-fired power, Eraring, or the other coal-fired power stations. But we've got technology solutions for that as well. These things just add additional cost on top of the very low cost of solar that make it a more even spread, a much more an averaged out kind of cost with storage and transmission lines and these grid balancing technologies. But it's pretty unstoppable. We just need that infrastructure built to access it. I think we'll take one more and then we'll ask the panel to share final thoughts. Thanks, Anna.
Anna Freeman, Clean Energy Council Australia. I'm asking a question to Martin, which he might think's a bit mean of me, but the session is ultra low cost solar. It's a revolutionary idea, I think, when you think about how disruptive it can be. And you were talking about before that we could find it everywhere. The question is, how low cost is low cost? What could we actually see, and where is the thinking at in terms of where we could see prices ending up?
Yeah, I tell you, I'm not an economist. I will not give you a number because we have seen on your slides how far off we all were by predicting this. So, but I tell you, when we a few years started in the research, when it was still very early, why perovskites were so interesting to us, because when you see how you see this game changing in curve costs, is you have the step functions in certain things. And this is again where perovskites can be a brand new manufacturing way, so which is much easier than what we're doing right now, which will significantly help kind of abundance of the materials, the way they're synthesized. So all of these elements, so if you do water flow chart, will indicate that yes, we can go significantly lower. So if you would talk to our experts, that might give you a number. I'm still very conservative there. I don't want to give you a number, but I tell you, I think if we are successful improving stability and getting some of these ideas implemented, you would see a significant cut. Not just, but look on the other hand, I mean, when you're hearing this, especially if you go for solar off-grid, we're reaching costs, which is, I've heard some power purchasing agreements which were like, oh my God, they're low because they're not linked. They're just for ammonia production in the MENA regions. And when you look at this, how far we came down. But I think this new technologies will even cut this further.
Great. Okay, well, maybe I'll extend that question to our other two panelists just to wrap up. Georgia and Rodrigo, what is your vision for ultra-low-cost solar? How far, well, if it's not a number, what's your vision for 2050 for ultra-low-cost solar? How do you see it playing out?
Thanks, Darren. I don't have a cost for ultra low cost solar, but I do want to leave you with a story and my vision for, I guess, Australia being a renewable superpower. There's a really lovely case study of a solar farm by Iberdrola, which is the Spanish developer, where they installed a solar farm in Narrandera. And they reached out to the local land council there to speak with the First Nations and engage the local First Nations on what were their priorities in terms of employment, skills, change in the community. And as a result of the project, they managed to employ some of the local traditional owners. And there's a really nice story of one of the ladies who was there installing the actual solar panels. Her son, when they drove past, said, "My mum installed this." And that's a really lovely example of generational change. So if we can have more of that as the bare minimum and not the gold standard, that would be lovely.
Great. Rodrigo, bring us home.
Well, Darren, thank you, Anna, for the question. And I would say that basically our vision for the future of solar at an ultra low cost is solar being the #1 electricity source in the world. As simple as that. We're going to be a solar world. We're going to be powered by solar, not entirely, but in a major share of it. And solar will help us develop and unlock many other technologies that depend on electricity. So I think it's our ticket to the future, basically.
Well, on that inspirational note, please join me in thanking the panel, Martin, Georgia, and Rodrigo. Thank you.